Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Ancient Egypt, Gift of the Nile. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to be talking about one of the world's most alluring ancient cultures, not just for me as a professor, and not just for you as students, and not just for the people of today, but going back all the way to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, people have been fascinated with ancient Egypt. So let's see what we're going to talk about. In today's lecture, we're going to start by talking a little about how we actually understand the chronology of ancient Egyptian history. And then what we're going to do is go through the main periods of that history. So we'll start with the rise of ancient Egypt, seeing how it came from these kind of two separate centers of power all the way to a unified state and eventually an empire. Then we'll go into the age of the pyramids, what we call the Old Kingdom. From there, we'll talk about the rise of Osiris in the Middle Kingdom, and then eventually finish off with Egypt as an empire under the New Kingdom here. And what I'm going to be asking you guys to learn along the way is the ability to reconstruct the history of ancient Egypt, identify the meaning of the pyramids and the mummies, kind of the things that are most famously associated with that culture, and then interpret some of the major archaeological and historical sources that we use as scholars to put this sort of history together. Okay, so the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids. Now let's move in to the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom changes things quite a bit, all right? So we've still got pyramids, but let's take a look at what a Middle Kingdom pyramid looks like here, all right? This is nothing to write home about compared to the Great Pyramid at Giza, and the other pyramids of the Old Kingdom, right? These pyramids have gotten a lot crappier. And that in part is because of a change in the concept of kingship during the Middle Kingdom, okay? And the way that kingship changes here is that the kings themselves kind of step away from being portrayed as all-powerful gods, okay? So in the Old Kingdom, the king is the all-powerful person, pretty much a deity himself. In the Middle Kingdom, what we see, and you can kind of see it here, is that the king has stepped away from being the kind of all-powerful god and is now portraying himself as a shepherd of the people. So somebody the people can actually kind of connect with. And part of the result of that is that they're putting a little bit less of labor into their own stuff and more for the people themselves. One of the other things that we see during the Middle Kingdom is the rise of the god Osiris, all right? So earlier on, we get Amun and Ra. Now we get Osiris as the main god, and he's kind of the god of the underworld. Now, the myth that goes along with Osiris is kind of an interesting one, and we'll do a short recap here. But essentially, Osiris is one of the early gods. Originally, he's the god of kingship in the normal kind of world, all right? And he's married to Isis, and he has a brother known as Set, or Seth, all right? Now, Set is not happy that Osiris gets to be the king, and so one day they get into a fight, and his brother chops him up into 14 pieces, all right? So that's about the worst case scenario for Osiris. He gets chopped up into 14 pieces, and his body parts are scattered all around Egypt. Now, luckily, he's got a very loving wife, and his wife Isis goes around and collects all those body parts, stitches him back together, then kind of creepily makes out with him, and 9 months later, you get the baby Horus being born, all right? So Horus is the offspring of the kind of put back together Osiris and his wife Isis. Now, Horus is basically out there for revenge of what happened, to avenge what happened to his father, right? And so Horus challenges Set, and after this series of epic battles, Horus eventually wins. And so now Horus becomes the god of kingship in the kind of overworld, right? The normal world. Osiris remains the god of kingship in the underworld, right? Kind of the god of death there. Isis remains the queen of the gods here, and Set is put back in his place, still remaining this kind of god of chaos. Now, in that story, right, with the putting back together of Osiris, you can kind of see the origins, the kind of religious origins of this idea of mummification, right? And so when we have mummification in ancient Egypt, it's kind of like recreating this process of preserving the deceased and allowing them to live on in the afterlife. Now, as the Middle Kingdom comes to a close, right, we get another one of these intermediate periods. And this one's particularly cool, right? So we get this group of people coming in from kind of the Near East, right? And they come down into Egypt and they're bringing new technologies, right? So they've got these war chariots, and they've got these kind of these bronze weapons. And we can actually see in the kind of archaeological remains from that period, the effects of the battles between the Egyptians and these groups this group that we call the Hyksos, Hyksos. And this is one of the kings of ancient Egypt during that time. And as you can see up here, right, he's taken a couple battle axes to the skull. So you can see the incision there and the incision there. So we can see the actual effects of war during this period. Now, eventually, after about 100 years, Egypt is able to emerge out of this into what we call the New Kingdom, and now they're incorporating the technologies of this invading group. So now Egypt has the war chariots. Now, when we look at the New Kingdom in Egypt, all right, you can see that we're about 1,000 years removed from the age of the pyramids, right? So we're quite a bit away from this time-wise. And what we want to associate with the New Kingdom are things like King Tut and the beautiful burial mask here, as well as kind of the grand temples at Luxor and Karnak and things like that. Now, one of the other things that we want to associate with the New Kingdom is the fact that this is kind of the age of empire for Egypt. So we've talked a lot about kind of the geography of Egypt and how conducive it is to kind of being a successful, strong state because of how well it's protected. But that works two ways, right? If you're really, really well protected because of all these barriers, right, that also makes it difficult to expand outside of these areas. But finally in the New Kingdom, Egypt starts doing just that. And so we can see them moving out of their kind of traditional homeland in the Delta here, in the Nile River Valley, and we can see them going down south into what we call Nubia, and then up east and north into kind of the Levant area. Now, in order to do that, you need particularly strong kings, all right? And one of the most interesting of these kings is actually a female, right? And so we get the king or queen Hatshepsut as the first female pharaoh. And this is really cool, right? Like, you think about the fact that we haven't had a woman president in the United States, and that 3,000 plus years ago, the ancient Egyptians have a female ruling one of the strongest kingdoms the world had seen to that point. And one of the interesting things with Hatshepsut is that the artists have like a difficult time figuring out how to portray her. So sometimes, in this statue over here, she's portrayed strictly as a man, right? Like a normal pharaoh. Other times over here, right, you can see her actually portrayed in the pharaonic kind of garb with the headdress, but as a female herself. Now, Hatshepsut put together a bunch of political and social and military programs that were very, very successful during the New Kingdom. And as a result, we can see with her funerary monument at the site of Deir el-Bahri that she's got kind of one of the most iconic funerary monuments in all of ancient Egypt. But you'll also see that this is very, very different than the pyramids, right? It's kind of built into the walls here of the cliffside. It's not some kind of monumental pyramidal structure. And okay, so we talked about how people are moving away from the pyramids, right? And so the question then is, what are they putting all their money that they're gaining from these military expeditions, from running a strong state and taxing people, what are they putting that to? And the New Kingdom answer is essentially temples, okay? So we've got two big temples now. They're both in Upper Egypt, in the southern part of the country, and those temples are at Karnak and at Luxor. And they're moving back now to the god Amun, right? So we've got two temples to the god Amun down in the southern part of the country here. Okay, So everything's running really, really well, all right? So Egypt is strong, they're expanding, kingship is strong, we've even got like a female pharaoh, things are good. And then in the middle of the New Kingdom, in the middle of the 18th dynasty, things get absolutely crazy. So we get this guy, Amenhotep IV, who decides to change everything, all right? So the first thing he does is he changes his name from Amenhotep, right, Amun being the root word, to Akhenaten, and Aten being the kind of key word here. Now the Aten is the sun disk, all right? So you can see the sun up here with the hands reaching out from it with little ankhs at the end of those hands. And what Amenhotep IV, now becoming Akhenaten, what he does is he makes the Aten the single god of ancient Egypt. So we've moved from this kind of culture, this polytheistic culture of many different gods, maybe one being exalted above the rest, but still many in play, to a nearly monotheistic kind of culture. And so what we see along with that, right, we see a near like kind of monotheistic focus on the Aten. We see a shift geographically in terms of where power resides, right? So in the Old Kingdom, it was up here in the Delta. In the New Kingdom, it's down here in Upper Egypt where Karnak and Luxor and Thebes are. And now what Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, does is he puts the capital, boom, straight in the middle of ancient Egypt. He also starts representing the king in a totally different way, right? So you can see how sculpture looks now compared to how it looked before. It's very kind of an emphasis on the hips, very elongated, a totally different style of representation. We also get one of the most famous wives in all of Egyptian antiquity, and that, of course, is Nefertiti. So one of the cool things that Akhenaten does is he almost always represents himself with his wife, right? With his wife, with his kids. That's kind of a cool thing. And it's Nefertiti that gives us one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Egypt, right? So this now resides in the Berlin Museum. So you have to actually go to Germany to see this thing. But it's kind of considered one of the most beautiful sculptures in all of the ancient world. Now, Akhenaten's reforms, they don't last, okay? So as soon as he dies, his son takes over. And his son is a guy that you all know, right, by the name of Tutankhamun. And what we see here, right, is Amun, as part of his name, is becoming the god once again. And so we kind of know Tutankhamun now because of the grave, right, that was discovered. But in antiquity, historically, the reason he was important is because he is the guy that basically gets rid of Akhenaten's reforms, right? Moves the capital to Thebes once again, goes back to a traditional style of representation, goes back to a traditional style of religion. Now, but of course the reason we all know Tutankhamun now, the guy we call King Tut, is because of the tomb itself, right? And the reason this is famous is because this is the only unlooted royal tomb that we have in all of Egyptian antiquity, right? So we actually know where a lot of royal tombs are because they were pyramids, because we've discovered the Valley of the Kings, which we'll take a look at in a second. But this is the only one that hadn't been looted. And it resided in the Valley of the Kings. And so what you'll see is that during the New Kingdom, right, no more pyramids. We think that they may have chosen the location actually because naturally above the kind of canyon that serves as the burial place, it kind of looks like a natural pyramid above there. But these are now kind of secretly cut into the rocks, all right? And the idea here is that people learned pretty quickly that if you have a giant tomb, a giant pyramid, right, and everybody knows where the king's buried, and everybody knows that the king's going to be buried with very, 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 very wealthy things, that thing is going to get robbed, all right? And so all the pyramids were robbed in antiquity. And so they tried to be a little bit more secretive in the Valley of the Kings. Now, all of those tombs got robbed as well, all right? Except for one, except for the tomb of King Tut. Now, this tomb was discovered in 1922 by the archaeologist Howard Carter supported by the kind of patron Lord Carnarvon. All right, and we can see over here him opening one of the doors in the chamber, and you can get the kind of layout for what this looks like, right? So we have an antechamber, the main burial chamber, a treasury with quite a bit of cool stuff. And as we look closer, right, what ends up happening is as Howard Carter goes in, right, people are asking from the outside, like, you know, what do you see? Like, what's in there? And his response, right, is, you know, wonderful things, which kind of sums it up if you were looking at this for the first time that anybody had seen it in 3,000 years. Now, one of the things that we can take away is that King Tut was a fairly minor king. He only ruled for about 10 years, right? We talked about how historically he changed things a little bit, but he wasn't huge in terms of military conquests or anything like that. And yet the grave goods associated with him are really incredibly spectacular. And so you think about what the tomb of a king like Ramses II must have been like, it must have just been nearly unbelievable. So again, when we look at King Tut and we think about him, right, historically he's important because he reverts to this kind of normal style of Egyptian culture where the capital's located, the style of portraiture, the style of religion, right? And then today he's important because this is the one and only royal tomb that we have that was discovered intact. Now, it's actually after King Tut that we see Egypt reach its kind of furthest extent. So Egypt pushes all the way up here, up through the Levant, almost up into what's modern day Turkey. And there they encounter the Hittite Empire up here, okay? And so they've now started running into other empires and fighting rather large-scale battles. And the biggest battle here is known as the Battle of Kadesh. And this takes place in 1274 BC. And this is really, really cool because this is the first battle ever where we actually have a written account of how the battle plays out. So we get the Egyptian kind of play-by-play of what's going on with this battle. And what's really cool is we also get the kind of account of this battle from the Hittite perspective. So I'm not going to spoil what kind of the outcome of this battle ends up being. You can read that on your own as part of the assignment. But it's really cool because this is the first play-by-play battle in Egyptian history. All right, now, all good things fall apart, right? And very shortly after the Battle of Kadesh, what we see is the new kingdoms start to fracture, all right? And Egypt itself, right, it actually makes a comeback after this. But this is part of this kind of larger Bronze Age collapse. Now, the Egyptians, they chalk this up to a group they call the Sea Peoples, all right? And they call this a group of like 9 different kind of ethnic groups that are raiding by sea and causing kind of destruction across the Mediterranean and into the Near East. Now, this causes the end of the new kingdom in Egypt, and eventually they'll rise in what we call the late period, and then they're ruled by the Assyrians and by the Persians and by the Greeks and by the Romans. But that's something that we'll get into at a later period. All right, so let's bring together some concluding thoughts here, right? Why is Egypt important in the big scheme of things? So one of the reasons is just the sheer time for which Egyptian culture lasted, right? So ancient Egyptian culture lasts for something like 3,000 years, right? And to put that into perspective, the United States has been around for 250 years, meaning we would have to last another 2,750 years just to equal the amount of time that ancient Egyptian culture was kind of in its heyday. The other kind of takeaway is all these things that we consider as kind of mysteries of ancient Egypt, right? The pyramids and the temples and the mummies, the burial masks, that sort of thing. These can all be understood as part of the kind of cultural and religious beliefs of Egyptian society. And finally, what we can see is that this is similar in some ways, right? Even though it manifests itself in different forms of architecture, it's similar to what's going on in other parts of the Mediterranean and the Near East during the Bronze Age, where we see the emergence of where we see the emergence of kind of state-level societies, stratified societies, materially complex societies in the kind of ancient Bronze Age from around 3000 to 1000 BC.